Imagine a nation sitting atop one of the most massive oil reserves on the globe, a nation whose chosen leader has the audacity to declare, "This oil belongs to us." Now visualize that within a mere 2 years of making that statement, foreign intelligence agencies have subverted journalists, financed street gangs, planted fabricated newspaper reports, and orchestrated mobs to rampage through the capital, all to oust that leader and return the oil to international corporations. This is not some hypothetical tale. This is precisely what occurred in Iran in 1953, and the tremors of that single event are still vibrating today, more than 7 decades later, influencing everything from the 1979 Islamic Revolution to the hostage crisis, the nuclear standoff, and the various wars and proxy conflicts currently ravaging the Middle East. This is the narrative of how Britain and the CIA toppled a democratically elected administration to safeguard an oil firm. It is a chronicle of greed masked as geopolitics, imperialism presented as anti-communism, and a clandestine operation so shameless that the CIA itself did not openly admit its involvement for 60 years. At the heart of this story is a man most people in the West have never heard of, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, whose only transgression was the belief that a country's natural resources should belong to its own citizens. To comprehend how this coup took place, you must first understand how Iran's oil was misappropriated in the first place. For that, we must travel back to the dawn of the 20th century, a period when the Persian Empire was decaying and European powers were circling like scavengers. In 1901, a British financier named William Knox Darcy brokered a deal with the Shah of Persia, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar. Darcy was a prosperous socialite who had acquired his wealth from an Australian gold mine and possessed a penchant for high-stakes gambles. The agreement he reached was staggering in its magnitude. In exchange for $20,000 in cash, another $20,000 in company shares, and a pledge of 16% of annual net profits, Darcy obtained the exclusive right to explore for, extract, and sell oil across a region spanning nearly 500,000 square miles of Persian land. That is an area larger than the entire nation of South Africa, surrendered to one man for what amounted to pocket change. Now, the Shah who signed this agreement was not exactly bargaining from a position of power. The Qajar dynasty was insolvent. The nation lacked modern institutions, and the Shah himself had been influenced by what historians euphemistically call generous bribes to key officials. The British minister in Tehran, Sir Arthur Hardinge, personally advocated for the deal. This was not a negotiation between equals. This was a fire sale, and Darcy walked away with one of the most lucrative concessions in history. However, locating oil in Persia proved to be significantly more difficult than anticipated. The southern regions were oppressively hot, hitting 50 degrees Celsius during the day and dropping to freezing at night. The landscape was governed by hostile nomadic tribes who were wary of outsiders. Darcy funneled money into expedition after expedition, managed by a geologist named George Reynolds. By 1904, he was on the brink of bankruptcy. He was forced to sell a majority of his rights to the Burma Oil Company just to remain solvent. By 1908, over £500,000 had been exhausted, and the investors were prepared to abandon the project entirely. They dispatched a telegram to Reynolds commanding him to halt all drilling operations. Then, in a moment resembling a film script, Reynolds struck oil. In May of 1908, at a location called Masjid-i-Soliman in southwestern Persia, his crew hit a massive oil field. Commercial quantities of crude began erupting from the earth. The following year, in 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was officially formed to exploit the find. It would later be renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and eventually become British Petroleum, the corporation we recognize today as BP. Here is where the narrative takes a turn that clarifies everything that followed. In 1914, just as the First World War was poised to consume Europe, Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, made one of the most significant decisions in military history. He decided to transition the entire British Royal Navy from coal power to oil power. Oil was lighter, more energy-dense, and provided warships with a greater range. But Britain possessed no domestic oil supply. It required a secured source, and Persia had exactly what Churchill needed. The British government acquired a 51% controlling interest in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for $2 million. With that single act, Iranian oil became not just a commercial asset, but a strategic cornerstone of the British Empire. The British government now held majority ownership, with two appointed directors holding veto power over all company choices and essentially a guaranteed supply of inexpensive fuel for the most formidable navy on earth. For Iran, this signified something entirely different. It meant the nation's most precious resource was now effectively owned and managed by a foreign government. Iranian laborers worked in horrific conditions in the oil fields of Khuzestan. They resided in congested shanty towns, while British managers enjoyed manicured lawns, swimming pools, and air-conditioned offices in segregated areas. The oil company paid Iran a pittance in royalties and refused to allow the Iranian government to audit its records to confirm that even those small payments were accurate. To illustrate how unbalanced this arrangement was in 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company reported after-tax profits of $40 million, while Iran's share was only $7 million. That is 17.5% of the company's profits. Meanwhile, the British government was collecting more in taxes from the company than Iran was receiving in royalties from its own oil. The British were literally generating more revenue taxing the profits from Iranian oil than Iran was making from owning the oil itself. Let that reality sink in for a moment, and the exploitation reached far beyond the financial ledgers. In the city of Abadan, the site of the company's massive refinery, which at its peak was the largest in the world, a rigid system of segregation divided British staff from Iranian workers. The British lived in a pristine green suburb with modern houses, cinemas, and social clubs. Iranian workers, the men who actually ran the machinery and moved the crude, lived in a district called Kagazabad, which translates to Paper City. This was because many of the homes were constructed from flattened tin cans and old crates. There was no running water, no electricity, and no sewage system. These men extracted one of the most valuable resources on earth and returned home to shacks. When Iranian politicians tried to negotiate better terms, the company stonewalled them. When the Iranian government requested to audit the books to ensure the meager royalties were calculated fairly, the company flatly refused. This was not merely economic exploitation, it was a national humiliation, and it fostered a rage that would eventually consume everything. It gets even worse. The company invested millions in growing its operations, constructing refineries worldwide, building a massive tanker fleet, and finding new oil sources that would eventually compete with Iran, all financed by revenue from Iranian crude. However, the profits from these subsidiary ventures were kept off the books when calculating Iran's royalty payments. Thus, Iran was not only being underpaid, it was being systematically defrauded by a company that used Iranian wealth to build an empire and then concealed the profits from its host nation. By the late 1940s, the situation had become unbearable. Across the Middle East, nationalist movements were challenging the old colonial structure. In Saudi Arabia, the Arabian American Oil Company, known as Aramco, had agreed to a 50-50 profit-sharing deal with the Saudi government in late 1950. This was a landmark event. If the Americans were willing to split profits equally with the Saudis, why should Iran accept 16% from the British? The comparison was degrading and ignited a fire in Iranian politics. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh. Born in 1882 into a prominent aristocratic family, Mossadegh was educated in Europe, earning a doctorate in law from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. He was a career politician, a constitutional nationalist, and by all accounts, an eccentric and theatrical individual. He was known for weeping during speeches, receiving foreign dignitaries while in his pajamas in bed, and fainting during parliamentary sessions. Whether this was genuine emotion or calculated drama, no one was ever entirely certain. But behind the theatrics was a sharp legal mind and an unwavering belief that Iran's resources belonged to the Iranian people. Mossadegh had been speaking out against foreign exploitation of Iranian oil for decades. In 1944, he returned to parliament and began forming what would become the National Front, a coalition of democratic, liberal, secular, socialist, and Islamic groups united by one demand: the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. The movement gained strength through the late 1940s as frustration with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company reached a breaking point. The turning point occurred on March 7, 1951, when Prime Minister Ali Razmara who opposed nationalization, was assassinated by a member of a radical Islamic group called the Fada'iyan-e-Islam. Razmara had argued that Iran lacked the technical skill to run its own oil industry. His murder stunned the political establishment, but also removed the last major hurdle to nationalization. 8 days later, on March 15th, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. Every single member voted in favor. Not one dissented. On April 28, 1951, the Shah confirmed Mossadegh as prime minister after the Majlis elected him by a vote of 79 to 12. Within days, Mossadegh signed the nationalization law into effect. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was to be dissolved and replaced by the National Iranian Oil Company. Iran's oil would finally belong to Iran. The reaction from London was immediate and enraged. The British viewed nationalization not as a legitimate act of sovereignty, but as theft. Even as late as the early 1950s, some senior British officials truly believed that Persian petroleum was actually and rightfully British petroleum because it had been found by the British, developed with British capital, and exploited through British skill. This was the mindset of an empire that still could not accept that the colonial era was ending. Britain's response was a three-pronged strategy intended to either force Mossadegh into surrendering or to destroy him completely. The first prong was economic warfare. Britain imposed a devastating embargo on Iranian oil. The Royal Navy sent warships to the Persian Gulf to enforce a blockade, and Britain threatened legal action against any nation or company that dared to buy Iranian oil. The 7 largest Western oil companies, known as the Seven Sisters, cooperated with the embargo, refusing to purchase or transport Iranian crude. To make up for the loss of Iranian supply, they simply increased production in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. Oil production across the Middle East actually rose by about 10% annually during 1951, 1952, and 1953. Even as Iranian output failed, the numbers tell a story of ruin. Iranian oil production dropped from 242 million barrels in 1950 to just 10.6 million barrels in 1952, a decrease of over 96%. Iran's economy, heavily reliant on oil revenue, was strangled. The Abadan refinery, then one of the largest on Earth, was shut down. British technicians were withdrawn, and without their expertise, Iran struggled to maintain operations. The second prong was diplomatic pressure. Britain took the case to the International Court of Justice and the United Nations Security Council. Mossadegh personally traveled to The Hague and to New York to argue Iran's case, and he did so brilliantly. At the UN Security Council in October of 1951, he gave a speech that captured the world's attention. He stated that the petroleum industry had contributed nothing to the well-being of the people or to the technological progress or industrial development of his country. The International Court of Justice eventually declined to intervene, ruling that it lacked jurisdiction. This was effectively a legal victory for Iran, but it did nothing to ease the economic pressure. The third prong, and the most insidious, was covert action. From the very start, the British government was quietly looking for ways to remove Mossadegh from power. MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, began laying the groundwork for what it called Operation Boot. They recruited agents, developed contacts within the Iranian military, and began building a network of assets that could be used when the time came. But Britain had a problem. It could not pull off a coup alone. Its influence in Iran had been badly damaged by decades of exploitation, and Mossadegh had expelled British diplomats from Tehran in October of 1952, after discovering the British embassy was being used as a base for intelligence operations. Britain needed a partner, and it turned to the United States. At first, the Americans were not interested. President Harry Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, sympathized with Iranian nationalism. Truman urged Britain to negotiate with Mossadegh and rejected British arguments for intervention. American officials were frustrated with what they saw as British arrogance and an inability to see that the age of colonial exploitation was over. Truman even sent envoys to Tehran to try to broker a compromise, but the British refused to make meaningful concessions. Everything changed in January of 1953 when Dwight D. Eisenhower took office. Eisenhower brought a new team that was much more open to the idea of covert action. His Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, a corporate lawyer with deep ties to Wall Street and the oil industry. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the CIA. The Dulles brothers viewed the world through a harsh Cold War lens. They saw communists behind every nationalist movement. The British played this angle perfectly. They knew the Americans were not going to overthrow a government to protect British oil profits, but they knew the Americans might overthrow a government to prevent it from falling to the Soviets. So the British reframed the entire issue. They stopped talking about oil and started talking about communism. They painted Mossadegh as a dangerous radical who was leading Iran toward Soviet control. They pointed to the Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party, and argued that if Mossadegh stayed in power, Iran would inevitably fall into the Soviet orbit. This was, by any honest assessment, a fabrication. Mossadegh was a staunch anti-communist. He had no love for Moscow. The CIA's own analysts knew this. A 1952 CIA study titled Probable Developments in Iran concluded that a two-day coup was not imminent. A follow-up report in 1953 reached nearly identical conclusions. But the Dulles brothers were not interested in nuance. They wanted action. By early April of 1953, Allen Dulles had approved $1 million to be used by the Tehran station in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. Planning meetings were held in Cyprus and Beirut between CIA and MI6 officers. On July 1st, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill approved the plan. 10 days later, on July 11th, President Eisenhower gave his final consent. The operation had two code names. The British called it Operation Boot, and the Americans called it TP Ajax, or more commonly, Operation Ajax. The man chosen to lead the operation on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a career intelligence officer, a Harvard graduate, and by all accounts, a quiet, unassuming man who looked nothing like the Hollywood image of a spy. A colleague once described him as the last person you would expect to be up to his neck in dirty tricks. But behind the wire-rimmed glasses and the courteous demeanor was a man willing to overthrow a democracy to achieve his mission. On July 19, 1953, Roosevelt crossed into Iran under a false identity. He carried a briefcase, a significant amount of cash, and a detailed plan to destroy a government. The operation had several components designed to work together to destabilize Mossadegh and create the conditions for a military takeover. First, there was the propaganda campaign. CIA operatives had been planting stories in Iranian newspapers for weeks, portraying Mossadegh as a communist sympathizer, an enemy of Islam, and a threat to the monarchy. Fake editorials were written in English, translated into Persian, and placed in Iranian newspapers as if they were the opinions of local journalists. The narrative was carefully designed to exploit fears already present in Iranian society. Religious conservatives were told Mossadegh planned to suppress Islamic institutions. Monarchists were told he was planning to abolish the Shah's throne. Moderates were told he was driving the country toward chaos. Second, there was the bribery. CIA money flowed to politicians, military officers, newspaper editors, mullahs, and street gang leaders. Allen Dulles's planning documents stated that the operation would pay journalists, mullahs, and politicians to attack Mossadegh as corrupt and power-hungry. At the same time, paid street gangs would be directed to attack public figures, increasing instability and creating the impression that Mossadegh had lost control of the country. Third, there was the critical task of securing the Shah's cooperation. Under Iran's constitutional framework, the Shah retained the power to dismiss the prime minister. The plotters needed the Shah to sign royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi, a pro-Western military officer, as his replacement. This would give the coup a veneer of legality, transforming what was actually a foreign-backed push into what could be presented as a legitimate exercise of royal authority. But the Shah was terrified. He was a weak and indecisive man who feared the consequences if the coup failed. Roosevelt met with the Shah secretly and applied enormous pressure, assuring him that both the United States and Britain fully backed the operation and that key military units had already pledged their loyalty to Zahedi. The CIA even sent Princess Ashraf, the Shah's own twin sister, back to Tehran to persuade her brother, though she was reportedly unenthusiastic about the mission. General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of the Gulf War commander, was also dispatched to help convince the wavering monarch. Finally, on August 13th, the Shah signed two decrees. One dismissed Mossadegh as prime minister, the other appointed Zahedi in his place. The documents were handed to Colonel Nematollah Nasiri, the commander of the Imperial Guard, who was tasked with delivering them to Mossadegh and arresting him. The first attempt took place on the night of August 15th. It was a disaster. Mossadegh had been tipped off, likely by members of the Tudi party whose cells had infiltrated the military. When Nasiri arrived at Mossadegh's residence with the dismissal decree, he was arrested by forces loyal to the prime minister. Other key conspirators were rounded up. The plan had collapsed before it even began. When news of the failed coup spread, the Shah panicked and fled the country, first to Baghdad and then to Rome. He was convinced his reign was over. In Washington, CIA headquarters sent a cable ordering Roosevelt to abort the mission and leave Iran. The operation appeared to be finished, but Roosevelt refused to quit. According to declassified documents, when he received the cable ordering him to stand down, he simply ignored it. There was at least one person in the room when Roosevelt got the message. His response was blunt. He said, "No, we are not done here." Whether MI6 deliberately interfered with the transmission of the abort order, as some sources have alleged, remains unclear. What is certain is that Roosevelt decided on his own authority to push forward with a second attempt. Over the next 3 days, Roosevelt worked frantically to reorganize the operation. He used bribery and, according to some accounts, death threats to get his Iranian agents back in line. CIA money may have even reached Ayatollah Kashani, a former Mossadegh ally and the Speaker of the Parliament, helping to turn him against the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Mossadegh made a critical error. Believing the coup had been defeated, he ordered his supporters to go home and return to their normal lives. He asked the Tudeh party members who had been patrolling the streets to stand down as well. This cleared the way for what came next. On the morning of August 19, 1953, crowds began flooding the streets of Tehran. Many of them were paid demonstrators recruited from athletic clubs in the impoverished neighborhoods of South Tehran with CIA cash. They marched through the city, waving portraits of the Shah and shouting pro-monarchy slogans. Simultaneously, military units loyal to the plot seized key installations, including the telegraph office and radio stations. Armored vehicles rolled through the streets. By mid-afternoon, the tide had turned completely. Tanks surrounded Mossadegh's residence and opened fire. The prime minister's home was shelled. Fighting raged across Tehran for hours. By evening, an estimated 200 to 300 people lay dead in the streets. Mossadegh managed to escape over a garden wall but surrendered the following day. The coup had succeeded. Iran's experiment with democracy was over. General Zahedi was installed as prime minister. The Shah was flown back from Rome, arriving to a carefully orchestrated hero's welcome. When he met Kermit Roosevelt, the Shah reportedly told him, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." Roosevelt later noted that by you, the Shah meant both him personally and the two governments he represented. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Mossadegh was arrested, put on trial, and originally sentenced to death. The Shah personally intervened to commute the sentence to 3 years in solitary confinement in a military prison, followed by house arrest for the rest of his life. He died in 1967 at the age of 84, still under house arrest, never having regained his freedom. Now came the real purpose of the entire operation, the redistribution of Iran's oil. In 1954, under heavy pressure from Washington and London, the Shah signed what became known as the Consortium Agreement. The arrangement was presented as a compromise, but in reality, it was a carve-up. British Petroleum, the successor to the Anglo-Iranian oil company, retained 40% of the shares. 5 American oil companies received another 40%, a reward for America's role in the coup. Royal Dutch Shell got 14%. A French company took the remaining 6%. Iran was allowed to keep nominal ownership of the National Iranian Oil Company, but the consortium controlled production levels, pricing, and access to markets. In other words, the oil that Mossadegh had nationalized for the benefit of the Iranian people was handed right back to the same Western corporations, except now the Americans had a seat at the table too. The only thing that had changed was who was getting a share of the plunder. The Shah, now firmly in power and dependent on American support, moved swiftly to consolidate his rule. In 1957, with direct assistance from the CIA and Israeli intelligence, he established SAVAK, a secret police force that would become one of the most feared and hated institutions in the Middle East. SAVAK had virtually unlimited powers. It censored the media, screened government employees, hunted dissidents, and became notorious for systematic torture and the execution of political prisoners. The organization's name became synonymous with state terror. All political opposition was crushed. The National Front was suppressed. Labor unions were dismantled. Universities were placed under surveillance. Iran became what one CIA historian later described as an absolutist kingship, a transformation from the turbulent but functioning constitutional monarchy that had existed under Mossadegh. The democratic space that Iranians had fought for over decades was simply erased. And yet, from the perspective of Washington and London, the coup was considered a spectacular success. Oil was flowing again. Iran was firmly aligned with the West. Communism appeared to be contained. The Eisenhower administration was so pleased that it began viewing covert action as a cheap and efficient tool of foreign policy. Just 1 year after Operation Ajax, the CIA used the same playbook to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, a coup designed to protect the interests of the United Fruit Company. The pattern was set. From Guatemala to the Congo, from Chile to Indonesia, the template forged in Tehran in 1953 would be replicated again and again across the developing world. But in Iran itself, the wounds never healed. The memory of the coup festered beneath the surface of Iranian society for a quarter century, growing more toxic with every year of the Shah's increasingly authoritarian rule. The Shah spent lavishly on modernization projects and military hardware, but the wealth flowed upward while millions of ordinary Iranians remained in poverty. The gap between the Western-oriented elite and the traditional society widened into a chasm. In an ironic twist, when the Shah attempted during the 1970s to assert more control over oil pricing through OPEC and refused to renew the consortium agreement upon its expiration, Western support for his regime quietly evaporated. The very same oil independence that Mossadegh had sought decades earlier, the Shah was now pursuing, and the response from Washington was remarkably similar: a withdrawal of the political backing that had kept him in power. Oil revenues had made the Shah feel invincible. He launched grandiose modernization programs, the so-called White Revolution, building highways, dams, universities, and factories. But the wealth was concentrated at the top. Corruption was rampant. The traditional bazaar merchants who had been the backbone of Iranian commerce for centuries were squeezed out by Western-style malls and imported goods. Rural communities were uprooted by land reform programs that looked progressive on paper, but devastated the agricultural economy in practice. And through it all, Savik watched everything. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Students disappeared from university campuses. Writers and intellectuals were hauled in for interrogation. Iran became a pressure cooker with no release valve, and the heat was rising every year. By the late 1970s, the pressure had become unbearable. A coalition of secular intellectuals, leftist activists, religious conservatives, and disaffected middle-class citizens united against the Shah. The revolution that erupted in 1978 and culminated in 1979 was fueled by many grievances: economic inequality, political repression, cultural alienation, but at its core was a burning resentment of foreign interference that traced directly back to 1953. When Ayatollah Khomeini's followers stormed the American embassy in Tehran in November of 1979 and took 52 hostages, they did not cite abstract ideology alone. They cited 1953. The embassy had served as a base of operations for the coup. The revolutionaries feared, with considerable justification, that it might be used for the same purpose again. The 444-day hostage crisis shattered U.S.-Iran relations and created a cycle of hostility and mistrust that continues to this day. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, the man who succeeded Khomeini, once justified the regime's uncompromising posture by drawing a direct line to the coup. He said, "We are not liberals like Allende and Mossadegh, whom the CIA can snuff out." The message was clear. The Islamic Republic defined itself in part as a fortress against exactly the kind of foreign intervention that had destroyed Mossadegh's government. It took decades for the United States to publicly reckon with what it had done. In the year 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged the American role in the coup, calling previous U.S. policy toward Iran regrettably short-sighted. In 2009, President Obama in his Cairo speech went further, acknowledging that the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government. In 2013, the CIA formally declassified documents confirming its central role in the operation. And in 2023, on the 70th anniversary of the coup, the agency went even further, publicly acknowledging that the operation was undemocratic. But for many Iranians, these acknowledgments came far too late. The damage was done decades ago, and the consequences continue to ripple outward. The nuclear standoff, the proxy wars across the Middle East, the mutual hostility between Washington and Tehran, all of it can be traced in part to those few days in August of 1953 when two Western governments decided that a country's democratically expressed will was less important than their access to its oil. There is a quote attributed to Mossadegh that captures the tragedy of this entire story with devastating simplicity. He said, "My greatest sin is that I nationalized Iran's oil industry and discarded the system of political and economic exploitation by the world's greatest empire." Think about that. A man nationalized his own country's resources through a unanimous vote in parliament, a perfectly legal act of sovereignty, and for that he was overthrown, imprisoned, and erased from history by the very nations that claimed to champion democracy. The story of Iran in 1953 is not just a historical curiosity. It is a case study in how power really operates when money and resources are at stake. It is a reminder that the language of freedom and democracy is often used as a disguise for something far more cynical. And it is a warning that the consequences of such actions do not stay buried. They grow. They mutate. They come back in forms that the original architects never imagined and cannot control. The CIA's own staff historian, David Robarge, summarized it best. He wrote that the agency carried out a successful regime change operation, but it also transformed a turbulent constitutional monarchy into an absolutist kingship and induced a succession of unintended consequences. The most impactful of those unintended consequences was the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So the next time you hear about tensions between the West and Iran, about sanctions and nuclear deals and drone strikes and proxy wars, remember where it all started. Remember a quiet, bespectacled spy named Kermit Roosevelt who crossed into Tehran with a briefcase full of cash. Remember a prime minister in pajamas who believed his country's oil belonged to his people. And remember that the decisions made in secret rooms in Washington and London more than 70 years ago are still shaping the world we live in today. If this historical revelation changed the way you view global power and the hidden hands of history, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. We are dedicated to uncovering the truths that were meant to stay buried. Join us as we explore the past to understand our future. The next chapter of history's greatest secrets will be revealed soon.